Hey there, my wedding planning friends, and welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, thanks so much for clicking on my video. I'm Emily Summer. I'm a wedding planner based in Montana, and I make weekly videos on wedding planning tips and advice. Today's video, we're chatting all about wedding cakes and answering all the questions that you have all about wedding cakes. We're just gonna go through the commonly asked questions that I see when it comes to your wedding cake and everything that pertains to that. So number one, how much does a wedding cake cost? Now there are a lot of factors that go into this. Primarily the overall size is going to be the biggest factor, of course. So you have a small like a cutting cake. If you and your partner just want to cut a cake and not actually serve it for all of your guests, then you would have a small cutting cake, which is usually 6 or 8 inches in diameter. Most of the time, these will go for about $40 to $80, kind of depending on the style of cake, how intricate your design is, and the flavors that go into that. However, if you plan to have a cake that is going to be your sole dessert that you're going to cut and serve to all of your guests, then this really varies depending on the amount of guests that you have. A lot of times the price for the cake will be per person, so how many slices it will feed. And that again will depend on how many people you have, the shape of the cake, how many layers and tiers you have, as well as the flavors, and then again, the overall design. So there's a lot of factors that go into the cost of the cake, so it's really hard to tell you what to expect when it comes to the overall price. However, if you are planning to have a cake as your sole piece of dessert, I would anticipate spending anywhere from $250 all the way up to $600 or $800, again depending on the size and the intricacy of the overall cake and design and all of that. Number two, when do I need to know the flavors or have a tasting? Typically, you want to do your tastings at least about 6 months in advance so that you can submit those flavors to your bakery so they can make sure they have all of the necessary ingredients and have the preparation that they need for your wedding day. Now, you can book your baker and have your cake reserved further in advance from 6 months, which I highly recommend, but you don't necessarily need to have a lot of those decisions made until a little bit further in the process. And you don't really want to lock in a lot of those decisions until you are further in your planning process, as your wedding colors might change slightly and just kind of the overall design, so you make sure that your cake is going to fit in seamlessly with the rest of your wedding. Number three, what do I need to know prior to going into a cake tasting? So when it comes to your cake tasting and making a lot of those final decisions as far as the overall look of your cake and the flavors and kind of the size and shape and all of that, you want to have 3 things. It's a good idea to know what your flowers are going to be for the overall aesthetic and the color purposes, because that might play a big role in kind of what the overall look of your wedding cake is going to be, especially if they plan to incorporate any florals into the cake on top or either into the frosting or some kind of design. So have somewhat of an idea of the flowers that you have and have your florist booked. It's also a good idea to have your venue and or the location of the cake figured out as well. So if you are having an all outdoor space, if your venue, everything's going to take place outdoors and you plan to have your cake outdoors, you want to make sure that you're communicating this to your baker as well, so that if they need to adjust on the ingredients that are going to be used. For example, a buttercream cake is not going to do very well outside for a long period of time. This is something that needs to be refrigerated, and for pretty much any dessert, if it's going to be outside for an extended period of time, you want to communicate this to your baker, and if they are planning to deliver the cake on site, coordinate that so that it can come a little bit later into the day, so that it's just going to be set out just before when it's needed, so that it's not sitting out in the hot sun all day long. The exact location of the cake placement too, if it's going to be indoors or if it's against some kind of backdrop or rock wall or something that has some sort of backdrop that should be matched, or something that's going to go cohesively with the cake, this might play a role into the overall look of your cake as well. And finally, you also want to know your guest count. So this is going to play a huge role in not only the cost of your cake, but also the size that you need and the shape and kind of how many tiers you're going to need and how you want to accomplish serving the number of guests that you're going to have at your wedding. Number 4, when do we cut the cake? Now, this is determined on a couple of things. If you want your cake cutting to be a photo opportunity, if you want to make sure that it's documented by not only your photographer, but if you want guests to be present for this, then this is going to play a role in where it is in your timeline, as you want it to be efficient and make sure that it's in a location that is going to make sense for the overall flow of your wedding. So a lot of my weddings, what we do, if it's in an indoor outdoor space, if guests are inside eating dinner and we do toasts inside eating dinner and dancing happens outside, then typically we will put the cake inside so that that can happen before we get everyone outside for the dancing. That way you're not having to get people in and out, or people aren't upset about missing the cake cutting or not knowing it's happening if they're outside and it's happening inside. That way we can kind of do everything that happens indoors and then move everyone outside for everything that's going to happen outdoors. If you don't plan on making this a whole photo opportunity and you want it to just be kind of subtle, maybe your photographer is going to document you and your partner cutting the cake, but you don't need all of your guests present, then you have a little bit more free reign of where to put the cake. And again, weather might play a factor, overall location as far as the sun and other elements, and the type of cake that you have might determine where the actual location and timing of this is going to happen. But typically you want to put the dessert somewhere that's going to be easily accessible for guests and visible for guests. So usually somewhere near either where dinner is taking place or near where the dancing is taking place if they're in two separate locations. Number 5, how do we serve the cake? So there's a couple different ways that you can do this depending on what the overall kind of style and flow of your wedding is going to be. If you have a plated meal where you're going to have catering staff that is serving every individual guest at their seat, some couples will choose to also have the cake cut and served this way. So you can still do your cake cutting, just the two of you, and have that photo opportunity. You would do this while all of your guests are still seated and finishing up their dinner, and then have the catering staff cut and serve the cake slices to guests while they're still seated. And maybe this happens during toast, right before toast, around that time before you start the dance floor. And a quick note on just cutting and serving the cake in general, highly recommend paying the cutting fee if you have a full service catering staff, as cutting a cake is a lot more difficult than it seems. There's a lot that goes into it to be able to get nice clean slices, and it can be very time consuming too. So you want to keep that in mind and make sure that you have somebody that is going to be designated to cut and serve your cake, especially if you have a large cake that is going to be served to all of your guests. If you aren't having it cut and served at the seats, then usually you'll have the cake cutting happen, and then while the servers are cutting and plating all of the cake is when you can do your dancing and then announce that cake is going to be served inside or wherever that's going to be, so that guests know that the dessert is now ready. That way you're avoiding guests kind of huddling around the cake table and just waiting for slices to be set up, and it can get a little bit crowded and stuffy. So it works really well to do your cake cutting, go to your dances, and then by the time the dances are all ready to go, the cake is ready to serve as well. Additionally, you can do cake cutting further into the night, so you can go straight into your dancing after your toast and your dinner, and then kind of take a break later in the night and do your cake cutting and serve the dessert then. That's totally up to you. This does kind of interrupt the flow of the dance floor if that's something you anticipate being an issue, if you think people are going to jump right into dancing as soon as the dance floor opens. Number 6, what is a groom's cake? So traditionally, there was something that's called a groom's cake in addition to your main cake that is served for your guests. Now, this is a very traditional tradition that we really aren't seeing this tradition take place that much anymore, which, if you don't know the history for a groom's cake, much like many of the other traditional wedding traditions, there's some interesting backstories about how these all got started. And if you don't know, a groom's cake originally was served as more of like a guest favor for your guests. So you had your main cake that you cut and served to guests at the wedding, and then the groom's cake was meant to be served as kind of like a favor as your guests leave. So something to have boxed up for them to take with them at the end of the night. And then the tradition was that the single women were to sleep with it under their pillow and dream of their future husband. I don't know about you, but I don't see this occurring anymore, and I'm not sure you want to include that into your wedding. However, I have seen couples that will have 2 different types of cake if you want to have a specialty type of cake, like a cheesecake or something, in addition to what your main serving cake is going to be. However, like I said, this tradition is not very common anymore, so it's definitely not necessary or expected. Number 7, how do we save our cake? So whether you are going to have just additional leftover cake in general, or you plan to save the top tier of your cake for traditional purposes, have this discussion prior to and make sure that you're communicating that with whoever is baking and or delivering your cake as well, so that they can provide you with boxes at the end of the night. So if you're anticipating having leftover cake in general, it's always good to have some type of box to be able to store this at the end of the night for any leftover cake. You also want to make sure that if you plan to save your top tier, you communicate that so they can send you with a small box that you can take home with you. If you have leftover cake, it's great to serve this if you're having like a next day brunch or luncheon or something like that, to serve to your guests and try and get rid of it if you have a lot of leftover cake. And then if you want to save your top tier, you want to make sure that you have something to put it in at the end of the night, and also a place for it to go. So if you're staying on site, if you're going straight to a hotel or whatever it is, make sure that you've got somebody that's going to be in charge of getting that top tier and bringing it someplace safe for you at the end of the night. And then when it goes to storing it, the tradition is to save it and then freeze it and eat it together on your first anniversary. So you want to make sure that you are putting it in an airtight container, something that's going to be sealed shut so that it will still be fresh when you go to eat it on your anniversary, and keep it in your freezer. And then the day before your anniversary, you want to move it from the freezer to the fridge and let it kind of thaw out in that fridge for 24 hours, and then set it out for room temperature about 5 or 6 hours before you plan on consuming it on your actual anniversary day. And number 8, where should we put the cake? We kind of talked about this earlier as far as location and maybe weather and overall type of venue and the type of cake might determine this. But as far as like physical location for layout purposes, as I mentioned before, you want to have it in somewhat of a visible and efficient spot. So whether that is going to be right near where the food will be happening and where guests will be seated for dinner, or towards the reception space where dancing will be happening. You also want to keep in mind that you have it up against a wall. You want to make sure that it's in a location that you can either get behind it, and whether that's like pulling the table out a little bit so you can get behind it, or be able to shift enough so that you can get a photo of the two of you being able to cut the cake and have room for that. Again, I just want to reiterate the type of cake. If you have a cake that needs to be refrigerated, you likely want to make that be an indoor location. If you don't have the option to do it indoors and everything has to be outdoors, have it refrigerated, have it someplace safe, and only put it out right before the cake cutting and dessert is going to happen. Not only for heat and sun, but also for bugs. Bugs love sugar, and if it's going to be outdoors for a long period of time, you're just asking for it to attract bugs. When it comes to wedding cakes, there are a lot of questions that I see over and over again, so hopefully this answered those for you. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If you did, please like and subscribe to get weekly videos on wedding planning tips and advice, and we'll see you next week.